In this brief lecture, I will be introducing the nerve cell or the neuron function and a term referred to as the electrochemical potential. If we take this term and break it down a little bit, for the electro portion of it, what we are dealing with, if you think back to previous science courses, talking about electricity, positive, negative charges, and the movement of positive and or negative charges. The chemical portion of this term is referring to elements, molecules, compounds, but it's also associated with the electro portion because they have a charge, and that is what we refer to as ions. The major ions that are involved in neuron physiology are sodium ions, potassium ions, and to a lesser extent, calcium ions, chloride ions, and negatively charged proteins. The word potential in everyday language is simply referring to ability, the ability to do something. In science, though, and in biology, it is talking more specifically about the ability to do work. And when we're talking about the neuron, the work that is being done, as we will see, is a message being sent down along the length of the neuron. Before we do talk about the neuron, though, let's talk about another example. Again, this is more of a physics example, but I'll pull in a battery here. This is just a regular 9-volt battery. And I'm going to simplify it as much as I can with the 9-volt battery. This is the positive terminal that we have here. This is the negative terminal on the other side. And it's as if running down the middle of this battery, we have an impermeable barrier. This impermeable barrier does not allow the charges, either positive or negative, to move from one side to the other. So what we have is an accumulation of negative charges on one side, the left-hand side in this case, and the accumulation of positive charges on the other side. As you know, opposites attract. So that means that the negative charges want to go to the right, the positive charges want to go to the left, but they can't because of this impermeable barrier. So how do we get them to actually move? Because what we have at this point is a separation of the charges, and we do have a potential, and this is referred to not as an electrochemical potential, but really just an electrical potential. Separation of the charges, we have the ability to do some work, but at this point no work is being done. How do we get some work to get done? Well, we have to have some sort of a connection between the two sides to allow for the movement of these charges. So if we have a wire or a conductor connecting the negative to the positive side, what we are going to have is the movement. And in this case, as we know, it is the movement of the electrons, it's the movement of the negative charges. And they are then going to move through this conductor in this direction toward the positive terminal. So these electrons that are moving, they may not necessarily be doing very much work. They have the ability to do some work, and if we stick something like a light bulb on the conductor as well, then we can see that some work can be performed. So what we have is an energy transformation here where we're converting electrical potential energy in the battery into light energy and heat energy as well that we see in the light bulb. Eventually, over time, of course, what is going to happen is those negative charges are going to accumulate on the right-hand side because they are attracted to the positive charges, and eventually over time this battery will lose its potential and it will lose its ability to do work. If however if it is a rechargeable battery, what you can do is plug it into a power supply, an electrical power supply, and you can use that in order to move the negative charges back over to the negative side, reestablishing that original potential and allowing that battery to once again perform some work. Now, what does this have to do with the neuron? Well, this is a typical representation of a motor neuron that we have here, the various parts of the motor neuron. Surrounding any cell Any cell, including this motor neuron, is a cell membrane, and that cell membrane is impermeable to ions. Ions generally do not cross the cell membrane. In the case of what we call excitable membranes, that includes neurons, it includes muscle cells, they're excitable because they have a difference in charge between the inside and the outside. In fact, they have an excess number of positive charges on the outside of the neuron in what we refer to as the extracellular fluid compared to on the inside, an excess number of negative charges in the systole or the intracellular fluid. Now, if we do take a voltmeter, if we take a couple of microelectrodes, have one just on the outside of the cell, the other one actually sticking into the cell, we can in fact measure that there is a difference between the inside and the outside, and that difference on average for a motor neuron is about minus 70 millivolts. Now you might recall that battery had a voltage of 9 volts. That's a very large difference or a very large potential to what we see in the motor neuron. Nevertheless, this is still a voltage difference between the inside and the outside. So what we do have is a potential, and we have the ability to do work. And this is also an electrochemical potential because these are not just electrons, they are not just protons, but they are elements and compounds that have positive and negative charges. In the case of the neuron, what eventually we do want to have is a message that's traveling from the dendrite end through the cell body, through the axon to the axon terminal. But in fact, what we do not have are individual charges, individual elements and molecules that are moving in that direction. That in fact does not happen. What does happen though is we do have charges at certain times when the neuron is sending a message that do pass through the membrane. So we do have at some point positive charges that will enter through the cell membrane and positive charges that will do the opposite. They will leave through the cell membrane. When this happens, that is when work is being done, that is when the potential, the charge is being used, and that is when a message is being sent. Now on the previous slide as well, I also said that a battery, if it is rechargeable, it can be recharged, but you need to provide an energy supply. Well, your neurons can also be recharged, but you can't just stick your finger in a socket and recharge them, of course. You need to use that universal energy source that you might recall from previous biology courses, and that is adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. Many uses of ATP in your body. This is one of them, to recharge your neurons after a message has been sent.